Ezekiel Cooper had ridden into more towns than he could count, and he had ridden out of every single one of them before the dust ever had a chance to settle on his boots. That was the plain truth of his life, laid out as flat and simple as the Kansas prairie he crossed in the spring of 1874, with nothing but a sorrel mare named Calico beneath him and a bedroll strapped behind the saddle. He was 28 years old, lean and sun-browned as old leather, with dark eyes that had a habit of scanning every horizon like a man who was always expecting something to arrive or something to leave. He traveled with a battered Winchester rifle in his scabbard, a Colt single-action Army revolver on his hip that he had earned playing cards in Abilene the winter before, and a heart that had grown so practiced at departures that he had stopped noticing the ache of them somewhere around his 24th birthday. He was not an unkind man. That was important to understand. People who saw him ride through their towns sometimes mistook his quietness for coldness, or his habit of staying only a night or two for arrogance. But Ezekiel was neither cold nor arrogant. He was simply a man who had never in his 28 years been given a compelling reason to stop. His father had been a drifter before him, and his mother had died of fever when Ezekiel was 7 years old, leaving him in the care of a series of relatives who never quite knew what to do with a boy who stared too long at open windows. By 15, he was working cattle drives from Texas northward to the railheads, sleeping under skies so vast and starred that they made every roof feel like a cage. By 18, he had tried staying in Dodge City for nearly 4 months, longer than he had tried anywhere, but the walls of his rented room had pressed in on him like 2 hands squeezing, and he had saddled Calico before sunrise one February morning and ridden south without a word to anyone. He had been doing that ever since, town to town, season to season, working as a hired hand here, a trail scout there, occasionally riding shotgun on a stagecoach when money ran thin. He was good at all of it. He was the kind of man people were glad to hire and sorry to see go, which meant he could always find work and he could always find a reason to move on to find it somewhere else. On this particular afternoon in early May of 1874, Ezekiel was riding toward a town called Millhaven, a small cattle trading settlement in southwestern Kansas that sat in a shallow valley between 2 gentle rises of land. He had heard about it from a rancher he had helped in Wichita, a man named Aldous Webb who had pressed a folded piece of paper into his hand with a name and an address and said, "You go see Henry Alcott when you get to Millhaven. Tell him Aldous sent you. He has been needing a good drover since October and he pays fair." Ezekiel had no particular intention of staying in Millhaven long. He figured he would spend a few weeks helping Alcott with whatever the man needed, collect his pay, and move on before the summer heat made everything uncomfortable. That was the plan. It was always the plan, and it had never once failed to work out exactly as he intended. The town appeared gradually, the way small towns on the prairie always did, a water tower first, then a church steeple, then the low silhouettes of buildings arranged along a single main street. The sign at the edge of town read Millhaven, Kansas, EST, 1869, and someone had painted a crude longhorn bull beneath the letters. Ezekiel slowed Calico to a walk as he entered the town, studying it the way he always studied new places, taking stock of the livery, the general store, the saloon, the sheriff's office, the width of the street and the temperament of the people moving along it. It was an ordinary town. He had seen 100 like it. He had left 100 like it. He was tying Calico at the rail outside the general store, intending to ask directions to Henry Alcott's ranch when he heard the sound. It was not a dramatic sound, not a gunshot or a shout or anything that should have stopped a man in his tracks. It was simply a woman's voice, carrying clearly across the street, and she was saying in a tone that was bone-tired and quietly furious, "I said that wheel is mine, Mr. Potts, and I will not be haggled out of it." Ezekiel turned. She was standing beside a wagon that was leaning badly to one side. Its left rear wheel splintered along one spoke and clearly failing, and she was facing a heavy-set man in a storekeeper's apron who had his arms crossed and his chin set in the way of a man who believed that being unpleasant would eventually wear down his opponent. The woman was tall for her time, perhaps 5'6", with dark hair pinned up under a wide-brimmed hat that had seen considerable weather. She wore a calico work dress in a shade of dusty blue, and her hands, Ezekiel noticed even from across the street, were the hands of someone who worked hard and did not apologize for it. She was young, he thought, perhaps 24 or 25, and she was beautiful in the way that people are beautiful when they are not thinking about it at all, when they are simply being fiercely, entirely themselves. "I'm telling you, Miss Turner," the man called Potts was saying, loud enough that 2 men on the boardwalk had stopped to watch, "that I have 1 wagon wheel left in stock, and I have already promised it to Judge Hennessy's man who is coming for it Thursday. I cannot give it to you even if I wanted to." "Yes. "You cannot give me something I am willing to pay full price for," she said, and there was no question in her voice, only the cool, sharp edge of a woman stating a fact that she found deeply irritating. "That is not a matter of whether you can or cannot, Mr. Potts. That is a matter of whether you choose to. The judge is the most important man in this county," Potts said, dropping his voice slightly as if the lowered volume made the words less ugly. "I cannot afford to offend him over a farm wheel." Ezekiel stood and watched this for a moment. He was not in the habit of inserting himself into other people's business. That was another of his rules, one of the many practical rules of a man who intended to keep moving. But there was something about the way Inez Turner planted her feet on that dusty street, something about the way she did not raise her voice or crumble under the storekeeper's immovable indifference, that made him walk across the street before he had consciously decided to do so. He stopped beside the wagon, looked at the wheel, then looked at Potts. "I can fix that spoke," he said. Both the woman and the storekeeper looked at him. The storekeeper's expression said he did not appreciate the interruption. The woman's expression was harder to read, something between wariness and careful assessment. "It only needs 1 spoke replaced," Ezekiel continued, speaking to the woman now. "If you have the wood for it, which this gentleman," he glanced at Potts with an expression that was politely neutral, "probably has in his yard, it can be done in an afternoon. You would not need a new wheel at all." Inez Turner studied him for exactly 3 seconds. He counted them without meaning to. Then she looked at Potts. "Do you have suitable wood for a spoke?" Potts sputtered. "Well, I suppose I have some ash stock, but I do not do carpentry work, Miss Turner. I am a merchant, and "The wood," she said. "How much for the wood?" Potts named a price. It was fair enough, and he seemed to realize, under the combined steady gaze of the woman and the quiet stranger, that he had run out of ways to be difficult without becoming outright rude. He turned and went inside the store, muttering. Inez turned to Ezekiel. Up close, her eyes were a deep, warm brown, and there was no simpering in them, no performance of gratitude. She looked at him the way a practical woman looks at a potential solution, with appreciation but without undue sentiment. "Can you actually do it?" she asked. "Or was that just a way to help me out of a corner?" "Both," he said honestly, and something shifted in her expression, something that was not quite a smile but was in the neighborhood of one. "I have done it before. Give me the afternoon." "I cannot pay much," she said, and she said it the way people say things they are not ashamed of but would rather not have to say. "My name is Inez Turner. I run the Turner farm about 4 miles east of here. My husband passed away 14 months ago, and I have been managing it alone since." "Ezekiel Cooper," he said. "I do not need much." They looked at each other for a moment in the bright Kansas afternoon, and something passed between them that neither of them could have named, something like recognition, though they had never met before in their lives. He fixed the wheel. It took him the better part of 3 hours, working in the yard behind Potts's store with a draw knife and a mallet, fitting the new ash spoke into the hub and securing the iron tire back around the rim, with a method he had learned from an old wheelwright in Missouri 6 years earlier. Inez stayed nearby while he worked, not hovering, not chattering, but managing a list of dry goods she had come to town to purchase, occasionally asking him a question about where he had come from or what had brought him to Millhaven. He answered simply and honestly, the way he always did. He was passing through. He had work at the Alcott Ranch if Alcott still wanted him. He did not stay long in any one place. She listened to this without comment, which he found more interesting than if she had said something. When the wheel was done, he helped her load the wagon, and she paid him what she could, which was $2 and a container of beef stew she had brought from home in a covered tin pot, kept warm by wrapping it in burlap. He ate the stew sitting on the tailgate of her wagon while she finished her business with pots, and it was the best thing he had tasted in weeks. There was patience in that stew, the kind of patience that came from someone who understood that good things required time and attention. He found Henry Alcott's ranch that evening in Alcott, a compact, grizzled man of 50 who wore his authority lightly and his suspicion cautiously, looked Ezekiel over and said, "Aldous vouches for you, that is enough for me. I need someone who can handle cattle and is not afraid of a long day. I have a herd that needs moving to the summer pasture in 2 weeks, and I have fencing that needs setting before that." "I can do both," Ezekiel said. "Good. You can bunk in the hand quarters. Supper is at 6. He settled in that first night in a narrow bunk in the small building behind Alcott's main house, listening to the other 2 hands, a laconic Texan named Rourke and a young man barely out of boyhood called Denny, breathe in the darkness, and told himself what he always told himself in a new place. A few weeks. That was all. Long enough to be useful and earn a fair wage, and then he would move on. He told himself that. He almost believed it. The following week brought work that was demanding and physical and satisfying, the kind of work Ezekiel was built for. He and Rourke spent 3 days setting new fence posts along the eastern boundary of Alcott's property, working in the rising heat with post hole diggers and wire stretchers and not much conversation, which suited them both. On the 4th day, Alcott sent him into Millhaven for supplies, and on the main street he nearly collided with Inez Turner, who was coming out of the post office with a letter in her hand and a look on her face that told him the letter had not contained good news. She looked up and saw him, and the troubled expression shifted, not disappearing entirely but settling back behind something more controlled. "Mr. Cooper," she said, "how is the Alcott Ranch treating you?" "Well enough," he said. He wanted to ask about the letter and did not. Instead he said, "Is everything all right?" She glanced down at the envelope in her hand, then back at him, and he saw her make a small decision. "My brother has written to say he cannot come out to help me with the spring planting after all. He has his own troubles back in Ohio." She folded the letter carefully, the crease precise, the gesture contained. "I had been counting on an extra pair of hands this season." "What do you need done?" he asked. She looked at him with the same measuring quality she had used on the wagon wheel, that careful, intelligent assessment. "Mr. Cooper, you already have employment." "I have employment Monday through Saturday," he said. "Alcott does not work his hands on Sunday." There was a long pause. A wagon rolled past them on the street, raising dust that caught the morning light. Somewhere down the block a dog was barking at something that probably deserved it. "It is a great deal to ask of a man's one free day," she said finally. "You did not ask," he pointed out. "I offered." She looked at him for another moment. The warm brown eyes were searching and cautious, and somewhere behind all that caution, grateful in a way that she was clearly unaccustomed to expressing. "All right, Mr. Cooper," she said. "Sunday, then. I could use help turning the south field before the week is out." He showed up at the Turner farm that Sunday at 7 in the morning with calico and his own tools, and no expectation of anything beyond a useful day's work. What he found was a farm that was functioning, but only just. A farm held together by the sheer stubborn will of one woman who had clearly been refusing to let it fall apart through nothing more than determination and an intimate knowledge of what needed to be done. The house was a solid one-story structure, weathered but sound. There was a good root cellar, a small chicken coop, a modest barn, and fields that showed the evidence of careful tending, but needed more hands than one person could provide. Inez Turner met him at the gate with a cup of coffee, black and strong, and 2 biscuits wrapped in cloth, and she put them in his hand and said, "Eat first. The mule can wait 10 minutes." And then she went back inside to finish her own breakfast with a directness that made him smile at his coffee. They worked the south field together through the morning, Ezekiel handling the plow mule, a thick-necked animal named Abraham who had a habit of drifting left, and correcting him required constant attention, while Inez followed with a hoe, breaking up the larger clods and working the turned earth. They did not talk much for the first 2 hours, but the silence was comfortable in a way that Ezekiel had rarely experienced with another person. Most silences felt like absences. This one felt like presence. Around mid-morning she straightened and wiped her forehead and said, without looking at him, "You do not seem like a man who is passing through." "I am always passing through," he said. "You seem like a man who is very good at telling himself that," she replied, and the words were not unkind, only honest, and he found he could not argue with them in any useful way, so he said nothing, and they went back to work. They stopped for lunch in the shade of the barn, eating cold cornbread and sliced ham and drinking water from the well, and she told him, quietly and without self-pity, about her husband, Thomas Turner, who had come west from Pennsylvania with her 4 years ago, full of ambition and goodwill and no particular knowledge of farming, and who had spent 2 years learning the land and beginning to understand it before a fever had taken him in March of 1873. He had been 31 years old, she had been 24. "I could have gone back east," she said. "My family said I should. They did not understand why I wanted to stay." She looked out at the field they had been working, at the neat turned rows of dark earth, and something in her face was peaceful and fierce at the same time. "But this land is mine. I put my own hands in it. Thomas is buried at the east end of the property under the old elm tree, and I am not leaving him there alone." Ezekiel looked at his hands around his water tin and thought about the difference between a person who stayed because they could not leave and a person who stayed because they chose to, and he understood for the first time that those were 2 entirely different things. He came back the following Sunday, and the one after that. It was not discussed or arranged in advance. He simply appeared at the gate at 7 in the morning with his tools, and she simply had coffee and biscuits waiting for him, and they worked, and the weeks accumulated around them like something being built without either of them quite intending it. By the 3rd Sunday, the conversation between them had opened up considerably, the way conversations do when 2 people have established that they can trust each other with silence, because then the words that fill that silence carry more weight. He told her about his childhood, the mother who died too soon, the father who was more idea than presence, the cattle drives that had given him his first real sense of freedom, and also his first real sense of loneliness, which he had not understood was loneliness until much later. She told him about growing up in a town in Ohio that had seemed wonderfully large until she saw the prairie and understood what space could actually mean. About the year she and Thomas had come west in a wagon with everything they owned packed into its bed. About the fear and the wonder of those first months on the Kansas land. One afternoon in late May, after a long day's work, she made supper while he repaired a broken hinge on the barn door. And when he came inside and washed up at the pump, she had set out 2 plates at the kitchen table without making anything of it. And he sat down and ate, and the kitchen smelled of wood smoke and roasted chicken and something that felt dangerously like home, and he ate his supper and tried not to think about it too clearly. Henry Alcott noticed the Sunday absences, of course. A man running a ranch notices the habits of his hands, and one evening in the first week of June, Alcott stopped Ezekiel near the water trough and said, with the careful neutrality of a man who had decided not to pry but could not quite resist, "I hear you have been spending your Sundays out at the Turner place." "Yes, sir," Ezekiel said. "She needed help with the spring work." Alcott was quiet for a moment, looking off at the distance the way experienced men do when they are choosing their words. "Inez Turner is a good woman," he said at last. stubborn as a fence post and twice as straight. She has had a hard time of it since Thomas passed. He looked at Ezekiel then, and his expression was not quite a warning and not quite an encouragement. It was something in between, honest and plain. I would just say to a man in your position, do not be something to a woman like that unless you intend to see it through. Ezekiel said nothing. He nodded once and went back to work. And that evening in the bunk he lay awake for a long time, staring at the low ceiling and turning Alcott's words over in his mind like a coin he kept examining for a meaning he had not yet found. June arrived in Millhaven in a wave of heat and long light. The summer grass came up thick on the hillsides, and the sky was the color of hammered tin in the afternoons. The cattle drive to summer pasture happened in the second week of the month, and Ezekiel rode with Alcott and the other hands for 5 days, moving the herd northeast along the creek bottoms. And it was honest, demanding work that left him too tired in the evenings to think about anything much. But during the long riding hours of those days, with nothing to occupy his mind but the slow movement of cattle and the wind in the grass, he thought about Inez Turner with a frequency and a depth that he had not permitted himself to think about her before. He thought about the way she laughed, which was rare but real, a full and unguarded sound that she seemed to surprise herself with. He thought about the steadiness of her, the way she approached every problem with the same methodical, undefeated attention, as if she had long ago decided that the world was going to be difficult and had chosen to be more difficult in return. He thought about the way she had looked at him across the kitchen table with those warm, searching eyes, not with expectation or demand, but with a kind of quiet attention that made him feel more clearly seen than he had ever been in his life. He also thought about what Alcott had said, and the more he thought about it, the more honestly complicated it became. He was Ezekiel Cooper, the man who never stayed. He had made a life out of not staying. He had convinced himself for a decade that this was freedom, and in many ways it had been, but freedom at a cost that he had been careful not to calculate too precisely. What would it mean to stay? Could he even do it? Could a man who had spent 10 years in motion simply stop, simply set his boots down in one place and say, "This is where I am, this is what I choose"? He did not know the answer, and not knowing frightened him more than anything had frightened him in years. When he rode back into Millhaven on the 6th day, dusty and trail-worn, he did not go to the Alcott ranch first. He rode east on the farm road and stopped at the Turner gate in the golden late afternoon light, and Inez came out of the barn with straw in her hair and a look on her face that was carefully, deliberately ordinary, as if she had not been wondering when he would come back, as if it did not matter whether he had or not. But her hands, he noticed, were clasped together in front of her in the way people hold their hands when they are working very hard to appear calm. "Everything come through all right?" she asked. "With the drive?" "Yes," he said. "He got down from Calico." He stood there in the fading afternoon light with his hat in his hand, and he said, without any preface or ceremony because he did not know any other way to say it, "I have been thinking about you the whole time I was gone." The carefully ordinary expression on her face did something complicated. The hands unclenched. She looked at him for a long moment, and he saw in her eyes a war between hope and caution, the particular war that grief-educated people wage when something good presents itself and they cannot quite trust it. "Ezekiel," she said, and it was the first time she had used his given name, and the sound of it in her voice was extraordinary, like hearing a familiar word in a new language and understanding it better than you ever had before. "I need to ask you something honest." "Go ahead," he said. "Are you going to leave?" she asked. Not accusatory, not pleading, just asking with the directness of a woman who had stopped having the energy for anything indirect. He stood there in the June evening, and he thought about every road he had ridden out of, every town he had left before the dust settled, every time he had saddled Calico before the sun came up and ridden away from something that might have been worth staying for. He thought about his bedroll, still tied behind his saddle the way it had been tied for 10 years, always ready, always packed, always aimed at the next horizon. And then he looked at Inez Turner standing in the golden light with straw in her hair and her hands unclenched, and her eyes asking him the only question that had ever really mattered, and he said, "I do not know yet, but I want to find out." And that is more true than anything I have said to anybody in longer than I can remember. She was quiet. Then she nodded slowly, the nod of a person accepting terms they have thought about carefully. "Then you had better come in," she said. "I made cornbread this morning and it will not improve with age." The summer deepened around them, rich and hot and full of work. Ezekiel continued his employment at the Alcott Ranch through the weekdays and spent his Sundays at the Turner farm. But as July wore on, the arrangement expanded naturally and without drama, as things tend to expand when they are given room and honesty. He began stopping by in the evenings after his work at Alcott's was done, sometimes just for an hour, to help with a repair or to sit on the porch in the cooling dark and talk. They talked about everything, about the land and the seasons and the nature of things that grew and things that did not, about books she had read in Ohio and places he had seen on the trail, about the strange mathematics of loss and what it left behind, about the future, at first in the abstract way that people discuss things they are not yet quite brave enough to claim, and then with increasing specificity and warmth. One Saturday evening in mid-July, as the sun was going down behind the low hills west of Millhaven, they were sitting on the porch of the farmhouse, the day's heat beginning to lift, and she was reading aloud from a collection of poetry she had brought from Ohio, one of the few luxuries she had allowed herself to pack when they came west, and her voice was low and unhurried, and the words moved through the warm evening air. And Ezekiel sat listening with his elbows on his knees and his eyes on the sky going amber and rose and deep blue. And the feeling inside him was something he did not have a good name for, something quiet and enormous, like standing at the rim of a canyon and understanding, for the first time, what depth actually meant. When she finished the poem, she closed the book and they sat in silence for a moment, and then he said, "I have been thinking about what Alcott said to me in June." She glanced at him. "What did he say?" "He said not to be something to a woman unless I intend to see it through." He kept his eyes on the sky. He was not wrong. "No," she agreed, "he was not." He turned then and looked at her, and she was looking at him, and the evening light was doing something extraordinary to the planes of her face, and he said, "I think I want to see it through, Inez. I think I want to stay." The words were not elegant. They were not the words of a man practiced in declarations. But she was a woman who had no patience for elegance that was not also truth, and she heard the truth in them plainly. And her eyes were very bright for a moment in the way that eyes are bright when a person is feeling something large and trying to hold it with appropriate dignity. "You think," she said, and there was the ghost of something teasing in it. "I know," he corrected himself, and the certainty in his own voice surprised him with how solid it was, how unambiguous, how utterly unlike the vague, restless wanting that had driven him from one town to the next for a decade. This was not restlessness. This was its opposite. This was the feeling of finding something and recognizing it. She reached out and put her hand over his where it rested on the arm of the porch chair, and her hand was warm and strong from all the work it had done, and she did not say anything for a moment, and then she said quietly, "I am glad, Ezekiel." It was not an answer to a question he had asked, not yet. It was something more careful than that, and he understood her caution, respected it. She had loved before and lost, and love was not something she could afford to spend recklessly. But her hand stayed on his through the rest of the evening, and that was its own kind of answer, and it was enough. August brought a different kind of crisis that neither of them had anticipated. There had been talk in Millhaven for some weeks about a man named Conrad Hale, a cattle speculator from Missouri, who had been buying up land west of town at prices that were good enough to tempt struggling homesteaders and bad enough to infuriate anyone who looked at them clearly. He had already acquired 3 properties, and there were whispers that he had his eye on several more, including the Turner farm, whose land, situated on the east side of town with its good creek access, was exactly the kind of property Hale's operation would benefit from. Ezekiel first heard about it from Rourke one evening in the bunkhouse, mentioned casually, the way bad news is mentioned in a place where bad news is common. He did not say anything at the time, but the next morning he rode to Millhaven and stopped at the sheriff's office, where he found the sheriff, a steady-eyed man named Crane, sitting at his desk with a cup of coffee and the look of a man who had been waiting for people to come in and talk to him about exactly this subject. "Hale is not doing anything illegal," Crane told him, and his voice was tired with the specific exhaustion of a lawman whose tools do not quite fit the problem he is facing. "He is buying land from people who want to sell. I cannot stop a legal transaction." "Is he pressuring anyone?" Ezekiel asked, "making people feel like they do not have a choice?" "There have been," Crane said carefully, "complaints about some of the men he employs. Nothing I can pin a charge to, but there have been complaints." Ezekiel thanked him and rode out to the Turner farm. He found Inez in the south field, and when he dismounted and walked toward her, she read something in his face before he spoke because she said, "What is it?" He told her about Hale. Her face went still and set in the way of a person receiving news they had been half expecting. "He sent a man to speak to me in July," she said. "One of his representatives. He offered me a price for the property." She paused. "I told him the farm was not for sale." "What did he say?" "He said I should think about it because farming alone was difficult for a woman." The way she said it, flat and almost clinical, conveyed a great deal about what she had felt in that moment and was still feeling. "I told him I had been thinking about it for 14 months and had reached my conclusion." Ezekiel looked at her for a moment, the stubborn set of her jaw, the quiet fire in her eyes. "What do you need?" he asked. "I need for Conrad Hale to understand that this farm belongs to a person who is not going to be moved," she said. "And I need to make sure I have everything in order legally, so that there is nothing he can exploit." The legal question was addressed the following week, when Ezekiel drove her into Millhaven to meet with the only attorney in the county, a thoughtful man named Mr. Whitfield who had his office above the bank. Whitfield reviewed her land deed and the property records carefully and confirmed that everything was in order, that her title to the land was clear and unencumbered. He suggested she file a formal copy of the deed with the county register as an additional precaution, which she did that same afternoon. But the trouble with Conrad Hale was not finished. On a Thursday evening in the third week of August, Ezekiel was riding back toward the Alcott Ranch when he came upon one of Hale's men, a broad fellow named Sturgis who had a reputation for persuasion of the physical kind, standing in the road outside the Turner farm gate. Sturgis was not doing anything that was technically a crime. He was simply standing there, looking at the property with his arms crossed, making a show of his presence that was clearly intended to be intimidating. Ezekiel rode up and stopped Calico in the road. "You need something," he said. Sturgis looked at him with the evaluating squint of a man who has spent time deciding whether other men are worth his trouble. He apparently decided Ezekiel was worth measuring, which was the beginning of an error in judgment on his part. "Just looking," Sturgis said. "The road is public," Ezekiel said pleasantly. "But if Mr. Hale has a business proposition for Miss Turner, he can come present it in town, in the daylight, with the sheriff available to witness it. Standing outside a woman's property in the evening is not a proposition. It is something else." Sturgis stared at him. Then he looked at Ezekiel's hand, resting on his thigh, near but not on the colt at his hip, and at Ezekiel's face, which was entirely calm and entirely serious, and he seemed to work through a calculation of his own. He uncrossed his arms and walked back to his horse and rode away without another word. Ezekiel sat in the road for a few minutes after he was gone, then turned Calico and went to the Turner farm. Inez opened the door before he knocked. She had seen him on the road, apparently had been watching from the front window. Her face was composed, but her eyes were tight around the corners. "Was that one of Hale's men?" she asked. "Yes," he said. "He did not do anything." but I think Hale is going to try to make you uncomfortable enough to reconsider selling." She said nothing for a moment, looking past him into the darkening yard. Then she looked back at him and said, "Would you be willing to sleep in the barn tonight? I do not ask it lightly, and I would not ask it at all if I thought—" "Yes," he said, before she could finish the qualification. He slept in the barn that night, and for 2 nights following, and Hale's men did not appear again. On the following Monday, Ezekiel went to see Sheriff Crane again and reported what Sturgis had been doing, and Crane rode out to have a conversation with Conrad Hale that none of them were privy to, but that apparently covered the relevant points, because the intimidation stopped, and within 2 weeks, Hale had moved his operations entirely out of the county, having found, perhaps, that Millhaven was less hospitable to his methods than he had anticipated. When Ezekiel told Inez that Hale had left the county, she was standing in her kitchen, and she turned from the stove and looked at him with an expression that was composed of several things at once: relief and gratitude and something warmer and less easily named. "You did not have to do any of that," she said. "I know," he said. She looked at him for a long moment. Outside, the late August cicadas were singing in the heat, a sound like the summer talking to itself. "Ezekiel," she said, and his name in her voice was still a thing of remarkable power every time. "I think I am falling in love with you." The words sat in the warm kitchen air between them, plain and honest, offered without decoration, because she was a woman who understood that the best things were usually undecorated. He crossed the kitchen in 3 steps and took both of her hands in his and looked at her face, at the warm brown eyes that had been doing him the impossible service of seeing him clearly for months, and he said, "I think I have been in love with you since you argued with Potts about a wagon wheel." She laughed, the rare full sound of it, surprised out of her as it always was, and it filled the kitchen and ran out through the open windows into the August afternoon, and he pulled her close and held her, and she let herself be held, which he understood was not a thing she did easily, and it was extraordinary, the simple, ordinary, extraordinary fact of it. This particular woman, this particular afternoon, this farm that smelled of earth and summer and something that was indisputably home. September came in slowly, the heat beginning to break in the evenings, the cottonwoods along the creek starting to go gold at the edges. Ezekiel had a long conversation with Henry Alcott on a Tuesday evening, a conversation that he had been thinking about how to have for some time, and Alcott listened to all of it without interrupting, which was one of the things that made Alcott a good man to work for. When Ezekiel was finished, Alcott said, "So you are not planning to move on?" "No, sir," Ezekiel said. "I am not." Alcott was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I am going to lose the best hand I have had in 5 years." "I am sorry for that." "Do not be." Alcott looked at him with something that was close to warm. "I think I always knew you were not going to stay forever." "I am glad you are staying for something that is worth it." He put out his hand and Ezekiel shook it. "I will need you through October. Can you give me through October?" "Yes, sir," Ezekiel said. "Through October." The agreement was reached. The rest of September and all of October were busy with the fall cattle work, the sorting and selling and the constant maintenance of a working ranch, and Ezekiel gave Alcott his full attention on the weekdays and spent every Sunday and most evenings at the Turner farm, helping with the fall harvest, laying in firewood for winter, doing the dozen things that a farm needed before the cold came. He also, in the second week of September, spent an afternoon in Millhaven that had nothing to do with cattle or fencing or farm work. He went to Potts's store, which had a small selection of jewelry alongside the practical goods, and he spent a considerable time looking at a ring, a simple band of gold with a small garnet set in it, modest and well made. And then he spent an even longer time having a private conversation with himself about whether he was truly, genuinely in his bones ready to do this thing. The answer, when he stopped arguing with himself and simply listened to what he actually felt, was unambiguous. He was ready. He had never been ready for anything the way he was ready for this. The restlessness that had driven him from town to town for 10 years was not gone, Exactly, it was still part of him. He did not think it would ever entirely disappear. But it had changed in character. It had become something different, not a need to escape but a direction. And the direction was toward her, toward the Turner farm, toward the life that was already half built between them and needed only his full commitment to be complete. He bought the ring and rode back to the Alcott ranch with it in his breast pocket, and he did not say anything to anyone about it. But Rourke looked at him across the supper table that evening with the slight squinting expression of a man who has deduced something he is choosing not to comment on. And Denny, who was 21 and romantic in the way that only the very young can afford to be, gave him a look that was close to openly conspiratorial, and Ezekiel ate his supper and said nothing. He proposed to Inez on a Sunday afternoon in late September. They had spent the morning harvesting the last of the kitchen garden, pulling squash and late carrots out of the cooling earth, and by midday they had come in and washed up and were sitting at the kitchen table with coffee and the particular comfortable silence that had become one of his favorite things about being with her. The autumn light was coming through the window, honey-colored, laying itself across the table, and she was looking at something outside, the elm tree at the east end of the property, Thomas's tree, and her face was peaceful and a little distant. He reached into his breast pocket and set the ring on the table between them. She looked at it. Then she looked at him, and her expression went through several things in quick succession, too fast to catalog, and settled on something that was deeply quiet and deeply alive at the same time. "Inez," he said, "I have been everywhere. I have seen a great deal of this country and a great many people in it, and I have never once wanted to stop. And then I met you, and I want to stop. I want to stop and I want to stay and I want to build something with you on this land that you love, and I am asking you to let me." He paused. "Will you marry me?" She looked at the ring for a moment longer. Then she looked at him and her eyes were very bright and she said, "Yes. I will marry you, Ezekiel Cooper." He reached across the table and picked up her left hand, and she let him slide the ring onto her finger, and then she turned her hand and looked at it in the autumn light, the small garnet glowing warm and deep, and then she looked at him with a directness and a fullness that made him feel, once again, in a way that he was beginning to understand he would always feel with her, completely and honestly seen. "It suits you," he said. "It does," she agreed, and there was no vanity in it. She said it the way she said everything, simply and truly. Then she set down her coffee cup and came around the table, and he stood and held her, and they stood like that in the quiet kitchen for a long time, in the honey-colored autumn light. They were married in November, on a Saturday afternoon in the Millhaven church, with its modest white walls and its plank floor and its windows that looked out on the brown winter grass of the prairie. Alcott attended, and Rourke, and Denny, who managed to be both taller and younger-looking in his good clothes. The minister was a gentle man named Reverend Gates who had a habit of crying at weddings, which he did not apologize for, and which Ezekiel found he respected. There were several families from the surrounding farms who came, people who knew Inez and had watched over her through the hard year and a half since Thomas's death, and who now sat in the pews with the warm, complicated expressions of people who have been hoping for something for someone they care about, and are now seeing it come true. Inez came down the aisle in a dress she had made herself from fabric ordered by post, a deep blue-green that was the color of creek water, with her dark hair done up with pins and a small cluster of dried flowers, and she walked with the straight-backed, unhurried stride of a woman who was not performing anything, who was simply walking toward something she had decided to do with her whole self. She looked at him the whole way down the aisle, and he looked back, and the rest of the room was peripheral, pleasant background to the central fact of her. He said his vows in a voice that was steady, because he meant them, and meaning things made him steady. She said hers in a voice that was equally steady and equally meant, and when Reverend Gates pronounced them married, there was a sound from the pews that was half applause and half something more private, the sound of people feeling something collectively. He kissed her, and she kissed him back, And it was the kind of kiss that was everything a first married kiss should be, brief enough to be appropriate, full enough to be a promise, and they walked back down the aisle together through the applause and out into the November afternoon, which was cold and bright and smelled of wood smoke and dry grass and winter coming. The reception was held in the church hall, with food provided by the neighboring farm wives. There was a remarkable amount of food, including 3 pies and a venison roast that Alcott had contributed from the ranch, and someone had brought a fiddle and a man who knew how to play it. And by evening the hall was warm and loud, and full of the particular happiness that small communities generate when they have something genuinely good to celebrate. Ezekiel danced with his wife 3 times, which was 2 more times than he had ever danced with anyone in his life. The 3rd time, she said, while they were moving to a slow waltz that the fiddler had obligingly provided, "Are you sorry?" "For what?" He said, genuinely puzzled. "For stopping," she said, and she was not asking it with anxiety. She was asking it because she was Inez, and Inez wanted to know the true answer to things. He thought about it for a moment honestly, about the open roads and the free horizons and the particular sensation of riding into an unknown town with no obligation to anyone. Then he thought about the kitchen in the morning light and the sound of her voice reading poetry and the way she faced hard things without flinching and the feeling of her hand in his on the porch in July. "No," he said, "I am not sorry." She looked at him with those warm, clear eyes. "Good," she said, "because neither am I." They settled into the Turner farm that winter with the particular intimacy of 2 people who have each been used to their own solitude, and are now discovering the profound strangeness and richness of sharing a space with someone who is also discovering it. It was not always easy. Inez had strong opinions about how things were kept and where they belonged, opinions formed through a year and a half of managing everything herself. And Ezekiel was a man who had spent a decade with all his possessions in 2 saddlebags and had never developed opinions about where anything belonged, because he had never had anywhere to put it. These differences required negotiation, and the negotiations were sometimes sharp-edged, but they were always honest, and they were always resolved, because both of them had decided that this was the thing they were building and they were going to build it right. He finally unpacked his saddlebags. It was a moment that arrived on a Tuesday in December, when the first real snow of the winter was coming down outside, and the house was warm from the stove, and Inez was in the kitchen making bread and humming something low and private to herself. And he sat on the edge of their bed and looked at his 2 battered leather saddlebags that had traveled with him for the better part of 10 years. And he opened them and took out everything that was in them and put it all away. His extra shirts went into the chest of drawers. His books, 4 of them, battered and well-read, went onto the shelf in the sitting room. His razor and comb went to the washstand. His other small items found their places. When the bags were empty, he folded them and put them in the bottom of the wardrobe. He sat for a moment looking at the empty room with the snow outside the window, at the ordinary beautiful fact of a room that had a place for everything he owned. Inez appeared in the doorway with flour on her hands, and she looked at the empty saddlebags and then at him, and she did not say anything, but her face said a great deal, all of it warm, and she went back to her bread, and he went to find his coat and cleared the snow off the front path, which was exactly the kind of task he had never done before because he had never had a front path that was his to clear. Winter gave way to the long Kansas spring of 1875, and spring brought with it the full weight of the farm work and also something else, something that Inez told him one morning in March with a directness that was entirely characteristic of her, standing in the kitchen with her coffee cup and looking at him steadily. She was expecting a child. She believed it would arrive in September. The feeling that moved through him at this news was unlike anything he had experienced before, a wide, vertigo-inducing rush of joy and terror that arrived simultaneously, and then settled into something deeper and more permanent, a sense of stakes and belonging and profound responsibility that made everything feel both more serious and more vivid. "Are you all right?" he asked, because she was looking at him with the considering expression of a woman waiting to see how a man handled news. "I am quite well," she said. "Are you?" "I am," he said, and then, because she was Inez and required the truth, "I am frightened and I am happier than I know how to say." She nodded, as if this was exactly the right answer. "Good," she said, "because that is precisely how I feel." Spring and summer were full. The farm demanded constant attention, the planting and the growing and the endless maintenance, and Ezekiel now gave it all of him rather than just his Sundays, and he discovered that full ownership of a task felt fundamentally different from part-time contribution. He made decisions about the south field and the root cellar and the new fence along the creek, with the deliberate care of a man who understood that these decisions would shape the years ahead. His years he was planning to be here for, and the weight of that future tense was not heavy in the way he had once feared it would be. It was grounding. It was the opposite of the vague, constant forward motion anxiety that had kept him riding for a decade. He also, in June, rode over to Henry Alcott's ranch and proposed a different arrangement than his previous employment. He suggested that he could work for Alcott on a contract basis for the 2 or 3 busiest periods of the cattle season, the spring sorting, the summer drive, and the fall selling, in exchange for a fair per-day wage, while maintaining the Turner farm as his primary responsibility. Alcott, who was a practical man who knew good work when he had experienced it, considered this proposal for about 30 seconds and then agreed to it. Millhaven itself became, gradually and without fanfare, the place where Ezekiel Cooper was from. The town's residents, who had initially received him with the cautious reserve that small communities apply to strangers, relaxed around him in the way that people relax around someone who has demonstrated that they are staying. He became a known quantity, the man who had married Inez Turner and was working the farm east of town, dependable and quiet and occasionally handy in a crisis, which was about as high a form of praise as Millhaven generally offered. He had one friendship that grew to mean a great deal to him, with a man named Samuel Bright, who ran the blacksmithing operation at the southern end of town, and had moved to Millhaven from Virginia 2 years earlier with his wife and 2 sons. Samuel was a large, deliberate man with a booming laugh and a habit of saying exactly what he thought, which Ezekiel appreciated enormously, and they fell into the comfortable pattern of 2 people who understand each other without requiring explanation. They drank coffee together on Saturday mornings when the town was quiet, and talked about practical things and sometimes about larger things, the nature of work and land and community, and the complicated business of making a life in a place where everything had to be built from the beginning. Samuel's wife, Clara Bright, became one of Inez's closest friends, which was a different kind of thing, quieter and more complex, the friendship of 2 women who had each come from somewhere else and chosen to build something where they had landed, and who recognized in each other the quality of that choice. In July, 2 things happened within a week of each other. The first was that Ezekiel, working alone in the east field on a hot afternoon, stopped to water Abraham the mule and found himself standing at the edge of the elm tree at the east end of the property, the tree under which Thomas Turner was buried. He stood there for a while, hat in his hand, in the shade of the wide-branching elm, and he thought about Thomas Turner with a respect that was simple and genuine. This was a man who had come here with courage and built something good and loved the same woman who now shared Ezekiel's life, and there was nothing in that to feel anything but gratitude for. He thought about the farm and what it had meant to Thomas to start it, and what it meant to him to continue it, and he understood that continuity as an honor rather than a competition, and it settled something in him that had been quietly unsettled since he moved in. The second thing that happened that week was a visitor. His father arrived. Ezekiel had not seen his father, a man named George Cooper, in 9 years. George showed up at the farm gate on a Thursday afternoon, looking considerably older than his 53 years, thin and weathered, and with the particular sheepishness of a man arriving somewhere he knows he has not earned the right to expect a welcome. Ezekiel stood in the yard and looked at him for a long moment. "How did you find me?" he asked. "Followed the word through Aldous Webb and Alcott," his father said. "Took some months. He looked at the farm, the house, the fields. You stopped." "I did," Ezekiel said. George Cooper was quiet. Then he said, "I heard you married." "I did," Ezekiel said again. Inez came out of the house, her condition visible now, her due date 2 months away, and she stood on the porch steps and looked at the older man with the clear-eyed assessment she applied to everything. Ezekiel made the introduction and she nodded once and said, "You will stay for supper." And it was not a question, and it was not quite an invitation either. It was simply the statement of a woman who had decided what was correct. George stayed for 3 days. They were not easy days, not exactly, but they were honest ones. Ezekiel had enough of his father's wandering blood in him to understand how a man got to be the way George Cooper was, and he also had enough of his own experience by now to understand that understanding was not the same as excusing. On the evening of the second day, they sat on the porch and his father said, quietly, that he was sorry. Sorry for the mother who had died without enough care. Sorry for the boy who had been left in the wrong houses. Sorry for the years of absence. He said it simply, without elaborate justification, and it was the most honest thing Ezekiel had ever heard his father say. Ezekiel sat with that apology for a while. Then he said, "I'm not sure what to do with a sorry that comes 30 years late." "I know," his father said. "I expect you to put it wherever it fits. I'm not asking anything from you, son. I just needed you to know it." After George Cooper left, riding west the way he always had, Inez asked Ezekiel how he felt. He sat with it honestly before he answered. He said, "I feel like a man who got a thing he needed and had already stopped needing it, but it is still better to have it than not." She nodded, understanding this completely, and put her hand in his. September arrived. The baby came on the 14th of September, 1875, on a clear, cool morning when the sky was the particular deep blue of early autumn, and it was a boy. A fine, loud boy with dark hair like his mother and a temper that announced itself immediately, and did not seem inclined to quiet down without cause. Clara Bright came to help with the birth, along with a capable midwife from Millhaven named Mrs. Holt, and Ezekiel waited in the kitchen for what felt like considerably longer than the 4 hours it actually was, drinking coffee he did not taste and sitting down and standing up and sitting down again with a frequency that Alcott, who had come to wait with him, found both amusing and touching. When Mrs. Holt came to the kitchen door and said, "You have a son, Mr. Cooper, and your wife is well," Ezekiel stood up so quickly he nearly knocked his chair backward, and Alcott put a hand on his shoulder and steadied him, and then they both stood there in the kitchen for a moment, 2 men, one of them considerably older and considerably more practiced at the concealment of emotion, being quietly overcome by the extraordinary fact of new life. He went in to Inez. She was propped up in bed, tired in a bone-deep way that did not diminish the fierce, clear light in her eyes, and she was holding their son, who had quieted his protest for the moment, and was simply existing in her arms with the complete self-contained authority of a newly arrived person who has found the world acceptable for now. "Come and meet him," Inez said. He sat on the edge of the bed, and she put the baby in his arms, and he held his son for the first time with great care and great wonder, looking at this small face that was both entirely new and entirely recognizable. And he had no words for any of what he felt, which was fine because words were not what the moment required. "What shall we call him?" Inez asked. They had talked about names during the summer. Several had been proposed and considered and gently set aside. Now, holding his son in the September morning light, he looked up at Inez and said, "James. James Thomas Cooper." Thomas for Thomas Turner, whose farm this was and whose courage had made it possible. James because it had been his mother's father's name, and because it seemed to him like a name that could belong to a person of any temperament and any disposition, a name that left room for whoever the boy decided to be. Inez looked at him with those warm brown eyes, and she did not say anything for a moment, and then she said, "James Thomas Cooper." Yes, that is exactly right. James Cooper was a vigorous and opinionated child who made his presence felt in every room and insisted on being part of everything that was happening at all times, which, given that everything happening at all times was the operation of a working farm, meant that he learned very early to be present for the milking and the planting and the feeding, and all the 100 other daily tasks that shaped the days. By the time he was old enough to walk and talk reliably, he was following his father around the farm with focused and relentless attention, inserting himself into every task with the cheerful certainty of a child who has no reason to believe the world is anything other than deeply interesting. Ezekiel discovered the pleasures of fatherhood with the same surprise with which he had discovered most of the best things in his life, not having anticipated them and finding them, when they arrived, more substantial and more rich than anything he had imagined. He was a good father, not because he had a model for it from his own childhood, he emphatically did not, but because he was a man who paid attention, and paying attention turned out to be most of what a child needed, along with consistency and honesty and the willingness to be physically present for all of it, including the parts that were exhausting and the parts that were difficult. The farm grew. Over the 3 years following James's birth, Ezekiel made a series of practical improvements that Inez and he had discussed and planned carefully. A larger barn, built with the help of Samuel Bright and several neighboring farmers in one of the barn-raising cooperatives that were common on the Kansas frontier. An expanded chicken coop. A second well dug closer to the south field. A small additional room added to the house, modest and well-built, looking south toward the winter sun. In the spring of 1877, Inez told him over breakfast with the same straightforward directness she had used 2 years earlier that they were expecting again. This time Ezekiel did not have to manage the vertigo of the first time. He simply looked at her across the breakfast table and felt the familiar rush of love for this woman, who informed him of large things over cornbread and coffee, as if the ordinary setting was the appropriate container for extraordinary news, and he supposed she was right, because their life had taught him that extraordinary things grew best in ordinary containers. The second child, born in October of 1877, was a girl, and they named her Ruth Eleanor Cooper, Ruth for the biblical quality of constancy and loyalty that Inez admired, Eleanor because it had a sound to it that pleased her. Ruth arrived with considerably less drama than her brother had managed, as if she had surveyed the situation in advance and decided that efficiency was the appropriate approach. She was a calm, observant baby who looked at everything with wide, serious eyes, and who from a very early age had a quality of stillness that was utterly unlike her brother's perpetual motion, and equally unlike either of her parents and entirely herself. James, who was 2 when Ruth arrived, regarded his sister for the first several months with the cautious assessment of a small person who is not sure whether this new development is good or bad. And then one afternoon Ezekiel watched from the doorway as James, apparently having made his decision, sat down beside his sister's basket and began showing her, very seriously and with considerable detail, a collection of smooth stones he had gathered from the creek, describing each one as if she understood every word, and something about the scene made his chest feel so full that he had to look away. Inez appeared beside him and looked at the same scene, and he felt her hand find his without either of them looking away from their children, and he held her hand in the warm kitchen doorway, and it was one of those moments that he had come to understand were the real substance of a life, not the dramatic events or the crises or the declarations, but these ordinary moments, unremarkable to any observer, that were in truth the most remarkable things that ever happened to a person. The autumn of 1878 brought a dry spell that worried every farmer in the county. The rains that should have come in September came late and thin, and the winter wheat planting was delayed in a way that meant everyone would be watching the following spring very carefully. It was not a disaster, not for the Turner farm, which had enough put by to weather a difficult season, but it was a reminder of what the land could do, of the way it held all the terms of the agreement and could change them without consultation. Ezekiel found, during the anxious weeks of that dry autumn, that his response to difficulty had changed fundamentally from what it had once been. The old Ezekiel, the Ezekiel who had ridden from town to town for a decade, would have felt, in a hard season on a farm, the pull toward departure, the sense that there were easier situations elsewhere, the convenient logic that said this particular difficulty was a good reason to move on. Instead, what he felt was the opposite, a deepening of his stake in the outcome, a strengthening of his need to be precisely here, working this specific problem, protecting this specific piece of earth and the people on it. Difficulty, he had discovered, did not make him want to leave. It made him want to dig in. He spent the dry autumn improving the irrigation ditch that ran from the creek to the south field, a project he had been planning for a year and had not yet gotten to, and the work was demanding and physical and satisfying. And by the time the late rains finally came in October, the ditch was finished and the water moved through it cleanly, and the winter wheat went in, and the farm was sound. He and Samuel Bright talked about the dry autumn one Saturday morning in November, sitting in Samuel's smithy with mugs of coffee while the forge ticked in the cold, and Samuel said, "I think Kansas is going to test every person who tries to stay here, one way or another. Some will hold and some will not. That is true of most things," Ezekiel said. Samuel looked at him with the slight smile of a man who has been paying attention for a while. "You know," he said, "when you first came to town I had a bet with myself that you would be gone before winter." Ezekiel looked at his coffee. "You would have won that bet about most places." "What was different here?" Samuel asked. He asked it simply, with genuine curiosity and no presumption. Ezekiel thought about it. He thought about the wagon wheel and the argument with Potts, and the way she had asked him, without any fuss at all, whether he could actually fix it or was just trying to help her out of a corner. He thought about the Sunday mornings with coffee and biscuits ready at the gate. He thought about the kitchen in the summer evening and the poem and the feeling of sitting beside someone and not needing to fill the silence with anything because the silence itself was enough. She was different, he said. It was not an articulate answer, but it was a complete one. Samuel nodded as if this was entirely satisfactory. Christmas of 1878 was the kind of celebration that small farmhouses produce when they are full of people who love each other, slightly crowded and deeply warm. Samuel and Clara Bright came with their 2 boys, and Reverend Gates came as he had taken to coming on holidays since Mrs. Gates had passed the previous winter, and Henry Alcott came, older now and with a slight stiffness in his knees that he did not mention, and the house was full of voices, and the smell of food and wood smoke, and the noise that children make when they have been given permission to be loud. James, who was 3 and had discovered that Christmas required significant enthusiasm, was enthusiastic about everything with an intensity that was exhausting and delightful. Ruth, 14 months old, watched everything from her mother's lap with her wide, serious eyes. Ezekiel stood for a moment near the doorway of the sitting room, holding a cup of cider and looking at the room full of people, and he had one of those extraordinary, ordinary moments when a person steps slightly outside their own life and sees it clearly, sees the shape of what they have made, and understands that it is good. He had been born to a woman who died too soon and a father who did not know how to stay. He had spent 10 years in motion, accumulating nothing, committing to nothing, belonging nowhere. And then he had ridden into Millhaven, Kansas, on a May afternoon in 1874, and a woman had argued fiercely about a wagon wheel, and here he was. Inez appeared beside him as she tended to do, moving through any gathering with the quiet efficiency of someone who knows exactly where she is going. She followed his gaze around the room and then looked at him. "What are you thinking?" she asked. "I am thinking," he said, "that I am glad I stopped." She looked at him with those warm, clear eyes. The garnet ring was on her finger, as it always was, and the room around them was full of the people they had gathered to themselves over 5 years of staying put, and she reached up and touched his face briefly, the light, sure touch of a woman who knows what she has and does not need to be uncertain about it. "I knew you would be," she said. He laughed quietly so as not to disturb the general noise of the room. "You did not know any such thing," he said. "You asked me honestly if I was going to leave." "I asked you honestly," she agreed, "because I needed to know the answer, but I hoped for the right one." She turned back to the room, to James careening around a chair leg and Ruth watching from Alcott's careful knee where she had apparently decided to install herself. "And you gave it." The years moved the way good years do, with the texture of work and season and small events that accumulate into a life. The farm became known in the county for the quality of its wheat and its steady management, and Ezekiel became known as a man whose word meant exactly what it said and whose handshake was a contract. He was elected to the County Agricultural Committee in 1880, a development that surprised him somewhat and amused Inez considerably, because she said it confirmed what she had told him years ago, that he did not seem like a man who was passing through. James started school in the fall of 1880, at the small schoolhouse that had been built on the north side of town 2 years earlier, and he went with the same intensity he brought to everything, arriving each morning with opinions about what he expected to learn, and coming home each afternoon with opinions about how accurate those expectations had been. He was a bright and argumentative student who made his teacher, a patient woman from Missouri named Miss Cartwright, work considerably harder than she had anticipated, and she and Inez developed a relationship that was warm and slightly conspiratorial in the way of two people who are united by the management of the same complicated small person. Ruth, meanwhile, was developing into a child who was as unlike her brother as possible and as entirely herself as anyone could be. Where James was noise and motion, Ruth was observation and consideration. She spent long periods in the kitchen garden watching insects move through the plants, or sitting very still at the edge of the creek, looking at the water with the concentrated attention of someone engaged in a private project of understanding. She was not unsociable. She simply had a relationship with silence and solitude that was entirely her own, and that both her parents recognized and respected. Her father because he understood from long experience that some people needed space, and her mother because she recognized in Ruth something of her own inner life. In the spring of 1881, a third child arrived, a boy they named William George Cooper. William because it was solid and they liked the sound of it, and George because Ezekiel had decided, after long thought, that giving his father's name to his son was not a continuation of something broken, but a choice to believe that something could be different. George Cooper Sr. had visited twice more in the years since the first time, each visit a little easier than the last, each one adding a small increment to a relationship that would probably never be uncomplicated, but was at least honest. William George Cooper arrived in April, and from his first moments displayed a temperament that was cheerful and adaptable, the kind of child who seemed to find the world fundamentally agreeable, which was a relief after the intensity of his older siblings. The summer that William turned 1, Ezekiel did something he had been thinking about for several months. He rode out on a Tuesday afternoon, alone on Calico, who was getting on in years now but still sound, and he rode west for about an hour, out to the open country where the grass ran all the way to the horizon and the sky was the whole of everything above. He sat there on horseback for a long time, the wind moving through the grass, the enormous sky doing what the Kansas sky always did, which was to make every human consideration feel appropriately small without feeling unimportant. He had come out here to do something that he had been putting off for no particular reason, except that it had felt like the right thing to save for the right moment. He reached into his jacket pocket and took out a small, worn piece of leather, a strip from one of his old saddlebags, the ones that had traveled with him for 10 years and now lived in the bottom of the wardrobe. He had cut it off before he stored them, just this one small strip, as a kind of token. He sat there looking at it in the afternoon light, this small remnant of the years of motion, and he thought about all the roads it had traveled and all the places it had been with him, and he felt gratitude for them, not regret, because those years had made him the man who was capable of recognizing Inez Turner across a dusty street, the man who had enough experience of the world to understand what it meant to find something worth stopping for. Then he tucked the leather strip back in his pocket, turned Calico east and rode home. The house was full of noise when he arrived. Supper was a lively affair, as it generally was now, with 3 children of varying sizes and enthusiasms and James at 10, conducting a running commentary on everything that had happened at school that week, which was a great deal, and Ruth at 6, sitting with her characteristic stillness and contributing observations at exact intervals that were invariably precise and occasionally devastating in their accuracy, and William, now barely a year old, participating by being loudly enthusiastic about the supper and about the existence of everyone at the table. Inez moved through it all with the ease of a person who is in her own element, managing the logistics of the meal with one hand and the thread of the conversation with the other. After supper, after the children were in bed, James and Ruth sharing the larger room and William in the smaller one that had been added specifically for this expansion, Inez and Ezekiel sat on the porch in the warm summer evening. The stars were extraordinary. They always were out here, where there was no city light to diminish them, just the full canopy of the prairie sky doing what it had always done, which was to be vaster than anything a person could fully comprehend. "I went out west this afternoon," he said. "On Calico, just to look at it." She glanced at him. "The open country." Yes, he leaned forward, elbows on his knees, looking at the dark yard and the starlit sky. "I wanted to check something." What did you want to check? He thought about how to say it. "I wanted to make sure I was not staying because I had forgotten what leaving felt like. I wanted to check whether the old pull was still there." She was quiet beside him for a moment. Then she said with perfect steadiness, "And is it?" "It is still there," he said honestly. "It is part of me and it always will be. But it is the same as it was when I came back from riding with the cattle drive in June of '74. It is pointing in a direction, and the direction is back here." He looked at her. "It is always pointing back here now." She looked at him in the dark, the starlight doing what it did, making everything both smaller and more significant, and she said, "You are a ridiculous man, Ezekiel Cooper." He blinked. "I beg your pardon. You rode an hour west to make sure you still wanted to come home," she said, and there was something in her voice that was trying not to be a laugh and not quite succeeding. "That is perfectly ridiculous." He considered this. "Yes," he agreed, "it probably is. But," she said, and she reached over and took his hand in hers, "I understand it completely." Of course she did. That was one of the permanent, extraordinary facts of his life. She understood him completely, without requiring him to be different than he was, without expecting the restless part of him to be erased, only redirected. She had not asked him to become someone else. She had simply offered him a place where who he was had room to become more than it had been. He held her hand under the Kansas stars, and the summer night moved around them, warm and alive, and the children slept inside, and the farm was quiet, and everything was exactly where it belonged. The years that followed were the years of building and raising and deepening, the kind of years that are not dramatic to recount, but are everything in the living of them. James grew into a young man who had his mother's precision and his father's ability to read a landscape, both physical and human, and who was talking by the time he was 14 about going to study at a college in Kansas City, a prospect that Inez thought was excellent, and that Ezekiel supported entirely, while also privately working through the specific grief of a parent who understands that the whole point of raising children is to send them outward into the world. Ruth grew into a young woman of unusual quietness and unusual depth, who had a talent for observation that translated into a gift for writing, filling notebooks with her own private form of record-keeping, part journal and part natural history, and part something entirely her own. William grew up sunny and social, inheriting apparently some of the ease with people that his father had learned by necessity, and which came to William by temperament, and he had more friends by the time he was 8 than the rest of his family had combined. In 1887, Henry Alcott, who was now 71 and increasingly in difficulty with his knees and the heavy work of the ranch, called Ezekiel to his house one afternoon and offered him the Alcott cattle operation at a fair price, not a gift but a genuinely reasonable transaction. He said his children back in Ohio had no interest in coming west to take it on, and he wanted the operation to go to someone who would run it well and with care. Ezekiel came home and sat with Inez at the kitchen table that evening after the children were in bed, and they looked at the proposition together the way they looked at everything together, with honesty and practicality and the willingness to take time before deciding. "It is more than we planned for," she said. "It is," he agreed. "But it is also a logical next step for what we have been building," she said. "It is that too." She was quiet for a moment, looking at the numbers he had written down on a piece of paper. Then she looked up. "Can we manage it?" "With good help and careful management," he said. "Yes, I believe we can." She looked at him. "Then yes," she said, "let us do it." The acquisition of the Alcott cattle operation changed the scale of their enterprise substantially. They hired 3 additional hands and took on more grazing land to the north of the original farm, and Ezekiel found himself spending his days in a wider territory of responsibility, managing cattle and men, and land with the accumulated knowledge of nearly 15 years in the county. The Turner farm remained the heart of it, the original piece of land with Inez's kitchen garden and Thomas's elm tree at the east end of the property, and the south field that he had plowed with Abraham the mule on the first Sunday he had come here. Abraham had long since gone to his rest, replaced by a younger and less opinionated mule named Beecham. Calico, who was 22 and old for a horse, spent her days in the pasture near the barn, still sound but retired from the long rides of their earlier years, and Ezekiel visited her every morning with an apple or a piece of carrot, a habit he had developed without quite deciding to and could not imagine giving up. She had carried him into Millhaven on that May afternoon in 1874, and he felt that he owed her all the comfort her old age could provide. When James left for Kansas City in the fall of 1888, Ezekiel drove him to the stage station in Millhaven himself, the two of them on the wagon bench in the early morning, the town still quiet. James was 18, taller than his father by an inch, with his mother's eyes and something of his father's watchfulness, and he was both obviously excited and working to conceal how much he would miss the farm, which was the kind of emotional complexity that made Ezekiel deeply proud and somewhat wistful. At the station, James shook his father's hand, and then, after a moment's hesitation that was purely 18-year-old awkwardness, embraced him. Ezekiel held his son briefly and said, "Write to your mother." "Every week," James said. He had his bag in one hand and a book in the other and the look of a person standing at the beginning of something. He looked at his father. "Will you be all right?" "I will be fine," Ezekiel said. "Go on." He drove home in the October morning, and the road east was as familiar to him as breathing. And when he came in sight of the farm with its well-built house and its barns and its fields going gold in the fall light, and Inez was standing at the gate because she had heard the wagon, he pulled the horse to a stop and looked at her, this woman who had been the reason for all of it, the stopping and the staying and everything that had come from both. She was 42 years old, and she was beautiful the way land is beautiful, with depth and complexity, and the evidence of everything it had weathered and continued to hold. She looked at him coming home alone, and she knew, without being told, that it had gone well, and she opened the gate for him, and he drove through it, and she closed it behind them. That winter, sitting by the stove with the first of James's letters from Kansas City in hand, Inez read aloud to the family assembled there, Ruth 17, and listening with her notebook in her lap, William 14, and listening with the particular attention of a younger sibling getting news from a world he has not yet reached, and Ezekiel in his chair with the fire warm on his boots. James wrote about the city and the school, and the people he was meeting, with the detailed observational quality his mother had given him. And then at the end of the letter he wrote about missing the farm, missing the smell of the fields and the sound of the creek and Abraham's replacement Beecham, who was, he said, not nearly as ornery and was therefore somehow less satisfying. They all laughed at that, and the sound of it filled the winter room, and Ezekiel looked at the three faces around him, his wife and his daughter and his son, and thought about the bedroll that had once been constantly packed, and the saddlebags that now lived in the bottom of the wardrobe, and he thought about the morning he had ridden into Millhaven and heard a woman argue about a wagon wheel, and he thought that if he had ridden past without stopping, which he might have done, which the old version of himself might easily have done, he would have missed all of this. He would have ridden on to some other town and some other temporary employment and some other departure, and he would have gone on believing that freedom was the open road. But freedom, he had learned, was not the open road. Or rather, the open road was one kind of freedom, the freedom of motion and possibility, and he had needed that freedom for a time, had been shaped and educated by it in ways he did not regret. But there was another kind of freedom that he had not understood until he found it, the freedom of chosen belonging, of being somewhere specific because you had decided with your whole self that this was the place, and these were the people, the freedom that came not from leaving everything open but from closing the right things, committing to the right things, and finding in that commitment not a cage but a foundation. He had come into Millhaven, Kansas, in the spring of 1874 with everything he owned in 2 saddlebags, a man who had never stayed anywhere long enough to unpack. And he had found, at last and beyond all his own expectation, a reason to put down roots, real ones, deep ones, the kind that do not pull out when the seasons get hard but only go deeper. The following spring brought the farm back to itself in the particular way that spring always did, the fields going green in waves from the creek outward, the cottonwoods leafing out along the water, the smell of turned earth and new growth that was, to Ezekiel Cooper at this point in his life, the smell of everything that mattered. Ruth announced in March that she had decided to become a teacher, which surprised no one who knew her, and had been offered a position at the Millhaven school beginning in the fall, which was perfect in every practical sense and also meant, though none of them said it outright, that she would not be leaving in the way that James had left, not yet, and this was a private relief to all of them and to no one in particular. Miss Cartwright, who was retiring, said Ruth was the most naturally gifted teacher she had encountered in 20 years of her own work, and this was not flattery but simple professional judgment, delivered in the direct manner of a woman who did not deal in flattery. William, at 15, was becoming interested in the cattle operation, following Ezekiel around the expanded range with the same relentless focused attention that James had once applied to everything on the farm. He asked good questions and remembered the answers and applied them, and Ezekiel thought, watching him move through the work with natural ease, that William might be the one who took the whole thing on eventually, not because it was expected of him, but because it genuinely suited him. On the first Sunday in May of 1889, 15 years to the month from the day Ezekiel had ridden into Millhaven, he and Inez walked together out to the east end of the property, to the elm tree where Thomas Turner was buried. They did this sometimes, not solemnly or ceremonially, but as a natural part of their relationship with the land and its history. The tree was magnificent now, its canopy spreading wide over the good Kansas grass, older than their life together, rooted in the same earth they tended. They stood there in the May morning, the farm behind them and the horizon all around, and the tree overhead doing what it always did, simply being rooted and enormous and alive. Inez had her hand through his arm. "I have been thinking," she said. "About what?" he asked. "About the fact that you are 43 years old," she said, "and you have lived in this county for 15 years, and I do not believe you have spent a total of 4 weeks away from it in all that time." "I have been content to stay," he said. "I know," she said. "I have too." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I was thinking we might take a journey. James will be finished with his first year of school in June. We could go to Kansas City and see him, all 5 of us." He looked at her. "A journey," he said, tasting the word. It was not a departure, it was not flight. It was a choice to go and an understanding of the return. "A journey," she confirmed. "And then come home." He smiled. The May sun was warm on his face, and the elm tree was heavy with new leaves, and the farm behind him was his in the truest possible sense, not just by deed but by choice, by decades of choosing, by roots so established now that they were simply part of what held the earth together in this particular corner of Kansas. "That sounds exactly right," he said. She leaned her head briefly against his shoulder, and he put his hand over hers where it rested on his arm, and they stood together under Thomas's tree in the May morning, 2 people who had chosen this life and each other with their whole selves. And around them the land was green and the sky was open, and there was nowhere either of them would rather have been. He had ridden into Millhaven once as a man with 2 packed saddlebags and no intention of staying. He would leave it now briefly, as a man with a wife and 3 children, and a farm and cattle and neighbors who were friends, and 15 years of roots that had gone down into this Kansas earth, so deep that no season could pull them. He would leave it and he would come back, because this was home, truly and finally and completely, the word he had not understood until he found the place and the person that gave it meaning. Ezekiel Cooper, who had never stayed in one place long enough to unpack, had unpacked, had put his shirts in the chest of drawers and his books on the shelf and his razor at the washstand, and had built something with his hands and his heart that would outlast him, planted in ground he had chosen with the most deliberate and joyful stubbornness of his life. He had found his reason. He had put down his roots. And every morning when he woke in this house, in this county, beside this woman, he understood what freedom actually meant. Not the road behind you, but the life ahead of you, chosen and tended and profoundly, irreversibly your own.